I want to start today with a very sobering thought. If the Syrian refugee population were a country, that country would have the lowest school enrollment rate in the world, 1/5 the level of sub-Saharan Africa. Today, only 25% of Syrian children have the opportunity to go to school and to learn to read and write. That means that we as a global community are dooming 75% of Syrian children to a lifetime of poverty and hardship. Because what are the possibilities other than that if you've grown up not knowing how to read and write? And what that means is that we're dooming our region to decades of destruction and despair, because it's going to be incredibly difficult to overcome this. Today, Syria is now widely considered to be the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime, the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. In fact, more than 50% of Syrians have had to leave their homes and have become displaced either within the country or in neighboring countries. Can you go under the light? Yeah. What I've just described is one of the most awful and tragic outcomes of the Arab Spring. I want to shift gears and describe an incredibly different outcome of the Arab Spring. Earlier this year in January, a young university student in Damascus literally hunted me down in San Francisco, like only a Syrian could. And he called me because they were establishing or creating the Damascus Startup Weekend. And this young group of Syrians found a way to get 200 others around the country involved in a startup competition. And they tracked down 12 other Syrians in technology around the world to serve as judges and coaches and speakers at this startup weekend virtually over the internet. The Wall Street Journal was as impressed as I was by this that they featured this column in the newspaper. Anyone who knows Syria before the revolution knows why this was an absolutely amazing outcome. Syria in pre-revolution times was a place where young people had grown up for decades being told no and needing to get permission for things that never came. And as a result, these young people were incredibly acquiescent, and they would have never organized something as simple as a startup weekend. It just wouldn't have happened. This is one example of many that I've experienced over the course of the last 3 years, and so many of you have seen, not just related to Syria, but the Arab world. So what I've just described are two incredibly different outcomes of the Arab Spring. On one hand, our region is facing the darkest days of its history. We're seeing sectarian conflict. We're seeing humanitarian crises of unknown magnitude, of incredible magnitude. We're seeing beheadings and political assassinations. On the other hand, we're seeing young people empowered in a way that we've never known. We just look at what happened on campus over the course of the last weekend with thousands of people, with over 1,000 people piling into various rooms to watch speakers. And it shows you that the Arab world is more alive than we've ever been before. We see determination and passion and a focus on building institutions and rebuilding our civil society among these young peoples that gives you incredible hope. Now, the odds are definitely in favor of tragedy. That's the direction we're headed in. And The Economist has been talking about this almost since the day of the Arab Spring, when they've been talking about tragedy and failure and all the things that make us shrink every time we see a new Economist cover come out. What I want to talk to you about today is how we tip the balance. How we tip the balance away from tragedy and towards this hope and energy we're seeing in the Arab world. And I personally believe that people in this room today have a huge role to play and are incredibly well positioned to play that role. I've been lucky, as Rami said, with Rami and Ahmed and many of the other people in this room, to be a part of this over the course of the last 13 years, where we started by building the Harvard Arab Alumni Association. We would have never imagined what we saw this weekend happening when we got on the phone and we got together for our first meeting, and later with Jusoor. So I've been lucky to be a part of some of these efforts where young people in the Arab world are coming together and saying, we want to change the course of the region. So what I hope you walk away with today at the end of our time together is two things. Number one, each of you feels a little bit more empowered and inspired to make a personal difference in the region. And secondly, you do it by always looking at innovative solutions. The magnitude of the challenge that our region is facing is unknown to the history of the world. And I'm glad that we're having this talk at the Harvard Business School, because it's going to take the most innovative solutions to be able to change course of our region's future. Stop for the camera. I want to use our time together to mostly do this as a case study in some of the work that Jusoor has done. And I'll tell you a little bit about the organization, but I'm going to focus on one of Jusoor's 3 programs. One of our programs, as Rami alluded to, is focused on refugee education in Lebanon. And as I mentioned earlier, that is one of the most daunting challenges our region is facing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to start by highlighting the nature of the challenge facing Syrian refugee education in Lebanon. What's going on? How bad is it? Why is it happening? I then want to spend some time talking about how a bunch of young people who have full-time jobs have come up with fairly inspiring solutions to make a big difference to some of those young Syrian children. And then I want to turn to the discussion of how we move from helping 1,000 children to how we move to helping 500,000 children, and frankly, the 2.5 million children that are now out of school, because we have to move in that direction. Just a couple words about Jusoor. This is an organization a couple friends and I started 3.5 years ago because we believed that if we could bring together the Syrian community from around the world and connect every Syrian family outside with a Syrian family inside, we could change the course of destruction that was unfolding in our country. Okay, I'm going to start with a video in just a second. This is a 30-second spot we ran over the course of the summer. We ran it across NBC and Al Arabiya during Ramadan, so many of you who've come from the region have seen this. But it will put us right in the heart of what's going on with those young children in Lebanon. And pay attention, it goes pretty fast. I love looking into Bayan's eyes, because when you look in her eyes, you see the longing of a child. And that's what education comes down to, because a child wants something to hold on to, a dream that they can call their own. And when Bayan is asked what she wants to be when she grows older, she says she wants to be a singer so that people can hear her voice. That is the most touching thing ever. And every child has the right to have people hear their voice. Today in Lebanon, there's 400,000 Syrian refugee children like Bayan. To put that in context, there's 350,000 Lebanese children of school age in the public school system in Lebanon. So it just shows you the magnitude of the challenge we're facing. The Lebanese government has been incredibly generous in opening up Lebanese schools to Syrian children. They've said that they will create a spot for every Syrian child to attend school. And the UN is working closely with them to offset all the costs associated with that. The reality is that 2 years into the crisis, this is widely seen as not a success ultimately. It's virtually impossible to create all those spots for Syrian children in Lebanese schools. And even worse, the children who are entering these schools are largely failing. The failure rate is over 50% and people are dropping out. So as we try to understand the nature of the problem so we can start to think about what inspiring solutions might be, I want to walk you through why people are dropping out of schools. This is a picture of some of the kids that Jusoor helped enroll in Lebanese public schools about a year ago. And we were really proud because we felt that we really wanted to get the kids into Lebanese schools because they'd get a certificate at the end of the day and it would be formal schooling. So you can see here they're in their school uniforms, first day of school. 1 year later, 11 of these children, 3 of them returned to Syria, which is normal. There's a lot of inflows and outflows, but again, that means another year of school is disrupted for those kids. But of the 8 that remained, 4 failed and 4 passed. And that's a better rate than we're seeing overall in the country. Here's what's happening. Challenge number 1 is the language challenge. The Lebanese education system is taught primarily in English and French. And these Syrian children come from Syria with very little language ability. I worked with Gharam, this girl on the corner here, when I was in Lebanon in December last year. She'd been in school, she's a 4th grader, and she'd been in school for roughly 3 months and came from Syria barely knowing the letters. And 3 months later, she was in a 4th grade science class. The textbook is all in English, completely in English. And so we were working on a passage about elephants and trunks and tusks. And I thought to myself, she barely learned the alphabet. Then she needed to learn to read and write it. Then she needed to learn this vocabulary and the grammar. It is absolutely daunting. So that is a huge reason that there's a major failure rate for these children. The other reason has to do with the trauma that these kids are facing. They have come from the most challenging situations. In Syria, they grew up witnessing incredible horrors in this war zone. And then they moved to Lebanon, where the refugee situation is often worse than the situation they faced at home. At home, they grew up in a world of dignity, where they had their own family, they had their own home, the fathers were able to work. And they moved to Lebanon now, where the fathers are having a very hard time finding any sort of work. It's often manual labor, and it's really taking a toll on families that are now living 3 to 4 families to a room. And as a result, these children are really feeling incredible trauma, and they go to the schools, and instead of the school being an outlet for them to be comforted and to get some of that opening up of the experience, they're actually coming home feeling heaviness. And so it's been very hard for them to succeed in these schools. So in this context, this is the situation. And tons of organizations are based in Lebanon right now, trying to figure out how they're going to solve this refugee education crisis. So you've got tons of NGOs there trying to work on it. Actually, let's hold, Mark. In this context, Jusoor has really emerged as one of the top organizations working in Lebanon when it comes to refugees. And now, various organizations, whether it's different entities that want to do research or different NGOs, will often approach Jusoor because they want to find out what we're doing with refugee children. And the government will often send people our way. So what I want to do with you is talk to you about 2 very different approaches we took that has led to more successful outcomes with these children. And the reason I'm doing that is to help begin to show the type of inspiring solutions that any of us can come up with. These are pretty basic solutions, but they came out of an experience of testing and iterating. So we literally showed up in Lebanon 15 months ago, and Hani Jisri, who's in the audience, basically is the miracle man behind all of this. But we showed up in Lebanon 15 months ago with no idea what it meant to run a school, to run a classroom, to teach Arabic literacy. If anybody walked into our classroom in the early days, they would have absolutely been horrified. And so we tested and we iterated and we kept trying out different things. And I think that's very much a theme of this discussion on inspiring solutions. And so I want to show you 2 of the latest things we've been testing that have had a major impact on the outcomes we're seeing. The first, one of the things Jusoor recognized really early on is this incredible passion among young Arabs to get involved and roll up their sleeves. And some amazing things started happening. We would post on our website, for example, we need somebody to redesign our website as a volunteer. And we'd get like 50 responses. And we posted, we need an intern as a volunteer. And we'd get an incredible number of responses. And so Jusoor has, until last year, never paid a penny to do anything. We had a staff of virtual Syrians around the world. And then they'd work with us and they'd say, thank you. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. It was a pretty amazing phenomenon. That's how we met Hani, and that's how we met Rose right here in the 3rd row. So we thought, what if we applied this to our situation in Lebanon, to educating these children? And so what we did is we decided to engage volunteers from around the world. And I'm about to show you a video, but since we founded the schools 15 months ago, there have been 200 volunteers from Syria, from Lebanon, from around the world that have become involved in this program. And as a result, I really believe, because of these volunteers, our schools are the happiest place in the world. And that is shocking, given the situation refugees are facing. They come in looking like ghosts, and they walk out happier than anyone can imagine. So let's play the video, and I'll walk you through a little bit of what's happening as we play it. These were some calendars that a volunteer wanted to create to raise money for the school with some of the children's artwork. On any given day, we have up to 20 volunteers in the school. It's pretty amazing. And they come from around the world. They come from Lebanon, from Europe, and from the US. one of the first weeks we got together, they were trying to crack just how they were going to educate these kids. I told you these kids are some of the happiest I've ever seen, and you can see in their faces. I mean, this is extraordinary. I almost felt you'd think I was staging this. Face painting effort that a volunteer came up with. And an effort with a clown around Eid for the kids that a volunteer organized. And then finally, we'll end here. This was volunteers painting one of our new schools. Hani posted something on Facebook, and he got something like 20 volunteers show up to paint a school when we were expanding in the Biqat Valley. So I love this because it highlights two things about volunteers. First of all, it highlights this unbelievable spirit. I just cannot get over every time we post something, the response we get. And secondly, it shows one of the things that I think is magical that Jusoor has been able to do, which is to mobilize all this energy. Rami talked about 65,000 members for Jusoor today, but I'd say over 1,000 of them have rolled up their sleeves and played a role in one of our programs. So I told you there were two things that were distinctive about our schools and why this effort is working and why people are looking at it and saying, what can we learn from it? I told you about the first one, which is volunteers. The second one, this is about working with Syrian refugees as teachers in the schools. And this is a new thing we started just a couple months ago. Today we have 40 Syrians that we've hired as teachers or administrators in the schools. And this is also pretty remarkable for a couple reasons. Those teachers have gone through exactly what the children have gone through. And they're able to overcome one of the biggest issues we need to overcome, which is that trauma. There's no way children are going to learn until we can open them up. And so the biggest thing we need to do is have them feel like children again and feel safe again, and then they can learn. So that was a big thing that happened with those Syrian refugees. It also safeguards our country's labor force. You know, when Syria goes back to normalcy, inshallah, the labor force can then return from these expatriate countries and is still vital and viable. And then the other thing it does that I absolutely love is it injects energy back into the refugee communities. The refugee communities are among the most depressed places in the world. We visited some the last time I was there, and it is really, really depressing. And what I love is we now have 40 people who go back at the end of every school day, not only with an income, but a new sense of purpose and focus and determination. And they've got work to do, and they've got new ideas. And so I love what it does for the community around them in addition to those people. So I'm going to show you a video, but it might shock you, because our children are incredibly hyper. And you might say, what are you talking about as a success? But what I want you to watch for is two things. I want you to watch for the expressions of these children, because you see exactly what I mean about the therapy that they're getting by coming to the school. Every single child, I watch this, every single child is smiling and engaged and alive. And you watch the impact. I was there 4 months ago when we opened the school, and they had nothing in terms of the knowledge of the alphabet. And here you can see the teacher, Miss Ilham, who's one of the refugees, has gotten through to them. So let's watch, but no judgment on the chaos in the classroom. I love that video for so many reasons, and especially because of the progress, because we email Hani every month and we say, what are the outcomes? What have you achieved? And seeing this is really exciting, because finally, after 15 months of iteration, it looks like we've begun to crack some progress and the kids are really learning, and it's just so heartening. So I'm telling you all this, not because I really want to focus on Syrian refugee education. I'm telling you all this as an example of what a bunch of young people can do when they put their mind to it. The Jusoor leadership team is founded by 8 people, like me, who have full-time jobs and are incredibly busy. And we do this on the side. And yet, despite all that, we've really been able to come up with some innovative solutions. In fact, I believe because we're all very much involved in the business sector, we can bring that lens to everything we do. And I was joking before with Mark, but it's very much this minimum viable product concept where we're testing, we're iterating, we're moving quickly. When Hani opened the first school, we had 3 or 4 different pilot programs going at the same time until we could figure out what to do. The story of how this was established, this program in particular, is relevant to this point. The board showed up in Lebanon 18 months ago in March 2013, and we said we want to do something with refugees. And so we met with anyone who would meet with us, the UNHCR, UNICEF, we met with Save the Children, with War Child, and we walked away with more questions than answers. Should we focus on children and literacy? Should we focus on people who are 12 years and older and needed vocational training? How are we going to operate in Lebanon? We had no budget, we had no license, we had no funding for this, and we had no idea if the refugee community was even going to trust us with their children. Who is Jusoor? They had no idea. And nonetheless, 3 months after that first visit, after we sent Hani to Lebanon, we opened the door to our first school. So for me, and honestly, I look back at that time when we went in March, and I put the odds at less than 25%, and thought to myself in the back of my head, was that a really bad judgment call to diversify the efforts of Jusoor? Could you ever even do anything? So I want to highlight that. All right. I've spent a lot of time talking about the challenge, and I talked a lot about the role that Jusoor has played in working and coming up with inspiring solutions. But as I mentioned, we've been able to solve the problem for 1,000 kids. 1,000 kids, 200 volunteers, 40 teachers. That is not going to get us anywhere near where we need to go. In Lebanon alone, there's 400,000 children. Across Syria and the other countries nearby, 2.5 million children. So that is the scale of the solution we need to be solving for. Having done everything we did in the last 15 months, we're now in a position to begin to think about scale and getting to a completely different dimension, because unlike where we were in March 2013, we now understand the magnitude of the challenge. And so I want to start to think about what inspiring solutions could be and really open this up as a discussion, because that is our role as young leaders who are going to be thinking about every daunting challenge related to the Arab world. We all have to push ourselves, not just to get involved, but to push the boundaries on inspiring solutions. So I have 2 ideas on what could actually make a really big difference and the type of things we'll begin to work on. The first idea, and I'll share mine and then maybe you can share yours in the discussion when we get to the Q&A if you'd like. The first idea has to do with English literacy. I mentioned that the Lebanese government, or English fluency rather, I mentioned that the Lebanese government is creating spots for Syrian children to come to the schools. And they've already created 100,000 spots for Syrian children. But as I mentioned, most of those spots are not translating into effective outcomes because largely one of the main reasons is the English barrier. And all of us have been trying to find a way to get these children up to speed fast enough, and it's really difficult. So I'd love to think about a solution that leverages some of the things we saw with the one laptop per child effort. So some of you know this, but One Laptop Per Child tried an experiment in Ethiopia where they dropped off a big box that was just taped up, and inside it were a bunch of tablets. And they wanted to see what children would do with those tablets. The idea was to help them become fluent in English or literate in either the local language or English. Within 4 minutes, the children had untaped the boxes and pulled out the tablets. And within a couple of weeks, children were singing the ABC songs in the villages, and they had already learned how to have 47 different apps on the tablet. I think there's something for us here that we can leverage. What I would love to see us do and move in the direction of technology is to partner with an organization like the Khan Academy. Partner to develop an English immersion program over the course of 6 months where we could take a child and we could leverage Google tablets or Microsoft tablets. All these organizations are dying to be a part of the solution. They're just looking for us to tell them how. They really want to be a part of this. So we could leverage all of this to have children learn English over the course of 6 months in a really robust way, designed specifically for the needs of the local environments, whether it was in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey. And then those children would have a much higher success rate in school because some of that trauma of being constantly behind would be overcome. So that's the first idea, and I think there's some real traction here, and one idea on the type of thing I'd love to see us begin to work on. Another inspiring solution, or another solution that will get us to the level of scale that we need. I believe we can't solve the education problem unless we solve the employment problem. The enrollment rates for children 12 years and up are much lower than they are for children below 12 years old. And that's because there's no reason for a young person to go to school if there's no chance that they'll get a job when they graduate. So, how do we find a way to employ these people? In Lebanon or in any host country, that is going to be virtually impossible. Unemployment rates in those countries are already incredibly high, north of 20%. So how do we take advantage of this global movement happening right now around freelancing? So companies have moved way beyond outsourcing to this new concept of freelancing now, whether it's Elance or Odesk. All these large Western companies are outsourcing to these freelance networks, IT jobs, administrative assistant jobs, jobs at all ranges of the education scale. And so the other thing I want to take advantage of besides that is I have been incredibly impressed by the technical capability of young Syrians. At the Illinois Institute of Technology, where we have 30 students now studying, the deans have come up to us and told us that these 30 students have left the Chinese population in the dust. They have won hacking awards. They have been pictured with President Clinton, with Michael Eisner. They are getting jobs at Goldman Sachs and at Motorola and at Larson Engineering. What Syria did in terms of the engineering capability that it developed, and it's probably the case all around the Arab world, is pretty impressive. So if we can leverage this freelancing trend and we can take advantage of this capability that was inherent in the young Syrian population, and we can work with a freelance network like Samasource, which was founded by a Harvard graduate that particularly focuses on building that freelance capacity in emerging markets, we can do something really interesting. Because then we create jobs for the Syrian community and also the Lebanese community, because part of our innovative solutions have to involve finding solutions for the host countries. Then you give students a reason to go back to school. So again, it comes back to getting down to that root cause. All right. I spent a fair bit of time talking about one case study to highlight this point of the role we can all play in making a difference for our region. I want to close with an example from a different country. So I was at the Guggenheim Museum a couple of weeks ago, and there they had an exhibition called Zero. And I thought this could be, what this movement, the Zero movement was doing, I thought could be a really interesting example for Syria, and really I thought was very inspiring. So Zero is a group of artists coming out of post-World War II Germany who wanted to completely transform art, moving away from everything old to so much that was new. And they wanted to do it as part of the rebuilding of their country coming out of World War II. And they wanted to move towards opportunity in art, purity in art, just a whole new space. And they chose the name Zero because they felt it was before square one. That's where their country had ended. And whether it's Japan or Germany, these two countries are great examples for us because these are countries that rebuilt themselves to greatness coming out of the darkest chapters that any of us can imagine. The difference, though, is that the governments largely shepherded that change. That was very much led by the German government and the Japanese government. And in our region, we can't rely on our governments for many reasons. So it has to come from us. What was neat about Zero for me, though, is that this was a social movement that supported and reinforced the work that the government was doing. And what it made me realize is that when we think about creating change and laying that foundation, it's going to come from artistic movements, it's going to come from musical movements, it's going to come from education, and so many different areas. So I think we all have a role to play. And it was interesting to see how everybody came together to create that cultural change in the underlying fabric of these countries. So here's the thought I want to end on. And I did some clip art by myself, so it looks kind of terrible. But what I want to end on, and once you're done laughing, is that when we get together again in 2020 at the Harvard Arab Weekend, 6 years from now, that The Economist will have recognized that we actually tipped the balance, that we collectively, that Arab youth were so engaged and so passionate and so determined to make a difference for their country that they established some of the biggest scholarship funds for Arabs in the world. And you can talk to Ahmed if you want to donate to the Harvard Arab Alumni Association Scholarship Fund. But everybody gave back because we wanted to educate our population, that young people never gave up. They kept coming up with new initiatives and new efforts and new drives to make a massive, massive difference in our region. And despite all the odds and the favor that we're in, we tipped the balance and created hope for our young people.